pull up Michigan on a map, it's the only U.S. state made of two completely separated landmasses, joined by a single 5-mile bridge over open water. Most people assume that's geography. A glacier did it, an ancient lake split a peninsula, the land just looks this way. But the line that splits Michigan has nothing to do with geography. It exists because Congress drew a state border using a lake that wasn't where they thought it was. And the war that followed forced America to invent a state shape that breaks every rule of how borders are supposed to work. In 1787, Congress sat down to draw the future of America, and they did it using a map that was wrong. The Northwest Ordinance was supposed to be one of the most important documents in the country's young history. It laid out how the territory north of the Ohio River would eventually become states. It set the rules for citizenship, for slavery, for surveying. And it described, in careful legal language, exactly where the future borders would run. One of those borders was supposed to follow a simple landmark, an east-west line drawn through the southerly bend of Lake Michigan, all the way across to Lake Erie. Clean, logical, easy to follow. There was just one problem. Nobody actually knew where that bend was. The maps available to Congress in the 1780s placed Lake Michigan too far north, sometimes by 30 miles or more. The cartographers had been working from second-hand reports, fur trader sketches, and educated guesses about a region most of them had never seen. The lake wasn't where they thought it was. So when surveyors ran the line described in the ordinance using the maps they had, the line came in too far north too. It cut east into Lake Erie above the Maumee River, which meant a small but valuable piece of land, including a future city called Toledo, sat inside what would eventually become Michigan. That was the line on the books. The line Michigan would later try to claim. The line nobody yet realized was based on a lake that had been drawn in the wrong place. But Ohio saw it coming. In 1802, Ohio was about to become a state. Their constitution was being drafted, and most of it was standard frontier state material: government structure, rights, the prohibition on slavery. But buried inside that document was a single clause that would, 3 decades later, redraw the map of the entire upper Midwest. The clause said this: if at some point in the future a more accurate survey of the region was run, and that survey showed Ohio's intended northern border falling south of the mouth of the Maumee River, then Ohio reserved the right to shift its northern boundary northward, to a line running from the southern tip of Lake Michigan to the northernmost cape of Maumee Bay. In plain English, Ohio wrote into its founding document a legal mechanism to grab a city that didn't legally belong to them yet, before Michigan was even a territory. Before anyone had run the survey that would prove the ordinance line was based on bad cartography. Before there was anyone on the other side of the table to argue back. It was a constitutional ambush. Ohio planted a landmine 30 years before there was anyone to set it off. And when it finally did go off, in the 1830s, it didn't just give Ohio its harbor back. It forced Michigan into the shape it has today. In 1805, Congress created the Michigan Territory using the original ordinance line, completely ignoring Ohio's constitutional clause. Both states now had legal claims to the same piece of land. Both believed they were right. Neither was willing to back down. And if you want to keep seeing how decisions made on paper still shape the country 2 centuries later, hit subscribe, because the next part is where this stops being a paperwork dispute and starts being a shooting match. When Michigan finally got organized as a territory and tried to claim what the ordinance line gave them, the landmine detonated. The federal government, trying to figure out who was actually right, ordered new surveys. And here is where the dispute went from confused to corrupted. Ohio's surveyor general was a man named Edward Tiffin, who happened to be a former governor of Ohio. He hired a surveyor named William Harris and gave him explicit instructions to run the line that favored Ohio's claim. Michigan, suspecting bias, correctly as it turned out, hired their own surveyor, a man named John Fulton. Fulton was told to run a competing line based on the original ordinance language. The 2 lines came in 5 to 8 miles apart. The space between them was a long, narrow trapezoid stretching from the Indiana border east to Lake Erie. 468 square miles of disputed ground. Inside that strip sat the town of Toledo, the mouth of the Maumee River, and a piece of shoreline that was about to become one of the most valuable harbors on the Great Lakes, the future eastern terminus of canal projects that would link the Mississippi watershed to the Atlantic. Both states claimed the entire strip. Both states started passing laws governing it. Ohio organized the territory into Lucas County. Michigan organized the same territory into Monroe County. Two governments, two sheriffs, two sets of taxes, all trying to enforce authority on the same dirt, in the same towns, on the same families. If you owned a farm inside the disputed strip, you might find a Michigan tax collector at your door in the morning and an Ohio sheriff serving you a notice in the afternoon. And there was no court anywhere that could tell you which one of them actually had jurisdiction. It was untenable, and it was about to escalate. By 1835, Michigan was pushing hard for full statehood, and it had a problem in the executive office, or, depending on how you saw it, a weapon. Michigan's territorial governor was a 24-year-old named Stevens T. Mason. He had been appointed at 19, was nicknamed the Boy Governor, and was absolutely unwilling to let Michigan become a state without the Toledo Strip attached to it. Mason mobilized the Michigan militia. Ohio's governor, Robert Lucas, mobilized his own. Two states, two armies. Frontier farmers in homespun clothing, carrying muskets older than they were, marching toward each other through October mud over a 5-mile-wide piece of land, watched breathlessly by newspapers across the country reporting that the Union was about to see its first interstate war. It didn't happen. Not really. The two militias never quite met. They marched, they camped, they postured. Officials from each state tried to arrest officials from the other and got chased back across the line. There were a handful of tavern brawls. And the only documented casualty of the entire Toledo War was a Michigan deputy sheriff named Joseph Wood, who got stabbed with a penknife during one of those brawls. He survived. The wound healed. The war produced more newspaper headlines than blood, but it produced enough panic in Washington that President Andrew Jackson decided he had to step in personally. And Jackson didn't care about Toledo. He cared about ending the embarrassment, preserving the political balance in Congress, and getting Michigan admitted as a state without setting the precedent that two states could go to war over a survey error and bully their way to a result. Jackson stepped in. And the deal he brokered is the reason Michigan looks the way it does today. Here was the deal Jackson and Congress put on the table. Ohio keeps the Toledo Strip, the 468 square miles, the harbor, the future canal terminus, the growing port town, all of it. In exchange, Michigan got two things. First, full admission to the Union as the 26th state, and second, as compensation for losing Toledo, Michigan got the western three-quarters of a vast, rocky, forested wilderness in the north, a region almost no one had settled, accessible only by water, covered in pine forest and granite ridges, locked under ice for half the year. The Upper Peninsula, 16,500 square miles. Roughly 35 times the size of the Toledo Strip, Michigan was being asked to give up. And almost everyone in Michigan thought they were being robbed blind. Michigan voters, given the chance to ratify the deal at a convention in September of 1836, rejected it outright. The Upper Peninsula, in their view, was worthless. A frozen wasteland of pine trees and bears, accessible by boat in summer and by almost nothing in winter. They wanted Toledo. They didn't want a wilderness. But Jackson and Congress had made the terms brutally clear. Take this deal or no statehood at all. No senators, no representatives, no federal funding, no place at the table. Michigan's legislature, panicking, called a second convention. December 14th, 1836. Ann Arbor, the dead of winter. It went down in history as the Frostbitten Convention. The temperature was brutal. Snow blanketed the ground. Roads turned to icy tracks that swallowed wagon wheels. Delegates trudged through drifts to a meeting hall that was barely heated, voting by candlelight in greatcoats they couldn't take off, breath-fogging in the air over the documents they were arguing about. The legitimacy of the convention was contested almost immediately afterward. Some historians argue it wasn't even properly constituted, that not enough delegates showed up to make it official under territorial law. But the result was what mattered. They voted yes. Michigan accepted the deal. 6 weeks later, on January 26, 1837, Michigan was admitted to the Union. And most of its citizens still felt cheated. They had given up a port for a wilderness, a city for a forest, a future for what they were certain was a frozen consolation prize. They were wrong, spectacularly wrong. They just didn't know it yet, because nobody had walked far enough north to find what was buried in the rocks. In 1843, 6 years after statehood, geological surveyors working the Keweenaw Peninsula, a long finger-shaped stretch of land jutting into Lake Superior, found native copper. Not ore locked inside rock, but pure copper sitting at the surface in pieces large enough to break a man's back lifting them. Within a decade, the Keweenaw became the most productive copper mining region on the planet. By the late 1800s, the Upper Peninsula was producing more copper than the entire rest of the world combined. The mines that opened during this period, Calumet and Hecla, Quincy, Champion, generated fortunes that built mansions in Boston and financed industries clear across the East Coast. And copper wasn't even the biggest story. Iron ore, found in the Marquette Range starting in 1844, became the foundation of American steelmaking. The iron pulled out of the Upper Peninsula fed the mills of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago through the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th. Without that iron, the steel that built American skyscrapers, railroads, and battleships would have come from somewhere else, at higher cost, on slower timelines. The girders inside the Empire State Building, the rails of the Transcontinental Railroad, the hulls of ships that crossed the Atlantic in 2 world wars, much of all of that started as ore pulled out of the rocks Michigan voters had been desperate not to accept. The worthless wilderness Michigan had been forced to accept turned out to be one of the richest mineral provinces in North America. The trade Michigan voters had thought robbed them of a port had handed them an industrial empire instead. Toledo became a city, a good one. A working port on Lake Erie that today has about 270,000 people. But Detroit, Grand Rapids, and the iron and copper economy of the Upper Peninsula built a state that made cars, steel, and machinery for the entire 20th century. The trade Michigan thought it lost is the trade that built Michigan. Today, the line that splits Michigan is still there. The Upper Peninsula holds about a third of the state's land area, 16,500 square miles, but only about 3% of its population. Roughly 300,000 people live up there. The Lower Peninsula has about 9.7 million. Until 1957, the only way to cross from one peninsula to the other was by ferry. That changed when the Mackinac Bridge opened, a 5-mile suspension bridge over the Straits of Mackinac that for a few decades after its construction was the longest of its kind in the world. It physically connected what politics had joined 120 years earlier. But culturally, the line is still the line. People who live in the Upper Peninsula are called Yoopers, a phonetic stretch of Yoopers. People who live south of the bridge, the Yoopers call Trolls because they live under the bridge. The two groups have different accents. The UP carries linguistic traces of Finnish and Cornish from 19th century mining immigration, words and rhythms you don't hear anywhere else in the country. They have different economies. Timber, mining, and tourism in the north, manufacturing, agriculture, and finance in the south. They have different politics, different sports loyalties, different identities entirely. There's a recurring half-joke in the UP that periodically gets serious. Secession. Becoming the 51st state. The state of Superior. It never goes anywhere. But it surfaces every decade or so, every time someone in Lansing makes a decision that the UP feels was made without them. The line drawn in 1836 didn't just split a state into 2 pieces of land. It split it into 2 ways of being Michigan. Look at Michigan again. 2 peninsulas, 1 state, a shape that looks like geography did it. A strait, a glacier, an ancient lake, a piece of land that got broken in half by some force older than maps. It wasn't. The line that splits Michigan was drawn by a mislocated lake on an 18th century map. By a constitutional clause, Ohio wrote in 1802 to grab a city that didn't legally belong to them yet. By a 24-year-old governor with something to prove and a war that produced exactly 1 stab wound. By a vote taken in a snowstorm in Ann Arbor by men who thought they were losing. Every state in America has borders shaped by geography. Michigan has a border shaped by mistakes, by people fighting over a city, miscalculating what they were trading for, and accidentally building one of the strangest state shapes on the continent. And here's the part the men in the snowstorm never lived to see. The trade they thought robbed them of a port handed them an empire of copper and iron instead. The wilderness they didn't want became the foundation of the industrial state they would eventually become. They lost Toledo. They got Michigan. It just took them 100 years to realize they had won. If you want to see how other state lines were drawn by accidents nobody talks about, check out one of the videos on screen. And if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe.